there is a particular kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with how much sleep you have had. It is not the tiredness that comes from a long day of physical work, the good heaviness in the muscles that settles over you in the evening and pulls you gently towards sleep. It is not even the tiredness that comes from a difficult week, from too many demands and too little rest, from the accumulated weight of ordinary life pressing down harder than usual. This is a different kind of tiredness altogether. It is the tiredness that comes from carrying something you were never meant to carry alone. From holding a tension that has no resolution in sight. From knowing, somewhere beneath the surface of your daily life, that there is something you are supposed to do, something you have been asked to do, called toward, perhaps even made for, and choosing, day after day, not to do it. Not out of laziness, not out of indifference, but out of something more complicated than either of those things. Fear, perhaps, or the particular exhaustion of a person who has been wrestling with a call they cannot accept and cannot quite let go of. Jonah knew that tiredness. He had been living inside it for longer than the story tells us. To understand Jonah, you need to understand something about the world he inhabited, the world of a prophet in ancient Israel. In the years when the northern kingdom was still standing, when the cities and villages and farming communities of that land were still going about their daily lives in the rhythms that had shaped them for generations. A prophet's life was not what most people imagine when they hear the word. It was not a life of constant revelation, of dramatic encounters with the divine that lit up the ordinary days with supernatural fire. Most of a prophet's life looked, from the outside, almost indistinguishable from anyone else's. You woke in the morning with the same quality of light coming through the same window, felt the same cool of early air before the day warmed, heard the same sounds of a village beginning its day. Animals, voices, the creak of a door, water being drawn from a well. And then, sometimes, not always, not on any predictable schedule, not in any form you could prepare for, something would come. Not a sound. Exactly. Not a vision, necessarily. Though sometimes those too. But something more like a pressure, a weight, a sudden and unmistakable sense of being addressed, of there being a message, and of the message being specifically yours to carry. Jonah knew this experience. He had lived with it long enough to recognize it immediately when it came. And when it came this time, he recognized it and ran. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. The text is spare and direct in its opening, the way the most serious things often are. No preamble, no extended description of the circumstances, no careful setup of the emotional landscape. Just, the word came, and the word said, "Go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me." Nineveh, for a moment, Let that name sit in the air the way it would have sat in Jonah's mind when he heard it. Not as a neutral geographical designation, but as something weighted with all the history and meaning that the name carried for anyone living in Israel at that time. Nineveh was the great capital of Assyria, a city of extraordinary size by ancient standards, a city that represented to the people of Israel and the surrounding nations the apex of a power that was terrifying in its scale and its reach, and its complete indifference to the suffering it caused in the course of its expansion. Assyria was not simply a rival nation. Assyria was the shadow on the horizon, the force that every smaller nation in the region understood. At some level, was eventually coming for them. Its armies were famous for a brutality that was not merely incidental to conquest, but deliberate. A policy of terror designed to break the will of resistance before resistance could properly form. And God was asking Jonah to go there, to walk into the heart of that city and call out against its evil, to stand in the streets of the most powerful and feared city in the region and announce that its wickedness had been seen, had been noticed, had reached the ears of the God of a small nation that Nineveh could, in military terms, have absorbed without particular difficulty. We are not told, in those first verses, exactly what Jonah felt when the call came. The text simply says what he did. He rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. Tarshish was, by the geographical imagination of the ancient world, about as far from Nineveh as it was possible to go. A distant western port, somewhere along the far edge of the Mediterranean. In the opposite direction from Nineveh by almost every measure. If the call was to go east, to go into the depths of the most powerful empire of the day, Tarshish was the west, the far, distant, as far as you can get west. Jonah was not merely declining the assignment. He was going in the exact opposite direction. He went down to Joppa. The port city of Joppa sat on the Mediterranean coast. And it was, in the ancient world, the place where the land of Israel met the sea. The threshold between the familiar world of hills and fields and villages and the vast, open, ungoverned expanse of the water. It was a city of ships and sailors and the particular culture that grows up around places of departure. Places where people are always either arriving from somewhere or leaving for somewhere. Where the permanent residents are outnumbered by those who are passing through. Jonah arrived at the harbor, and he found a ship going to Tarshish. The text notes, with a detail that feels almost deliberately ironic, that Jonah paid the fare. He did not slip aboard secretly, did not find some irregular passage. He paid. Fully. Properly. The going rate for a berth on a ship, heading in exactly the direction he wanted to go. He was making a plan. He was being thorough. He was, in the way that people who are running from something are sometimes extremely practical and organized in the mechanics of their flight, putting together a proper escape. And then he went down into the ship. Down The text uses this word deliberately, and we'll use it again. Down into the ship. Later, down into the depths of the sea. And lower still, into a place that would eventually be the lowest point any human being can reach and still be breathing. But for now, just down into the ship, into the hold. Perhaps into a berth somewhere below the deck. In the dark interior of the vessel, surrounded by the sounds of the harbor, the creak of ropes, the lap of water against the hull, the calls of sailors making ready to depart, the last ordinary sounds of the ordinary world that Jonah was about to leave behind. The sea at night, in that part of the world, has a quality that is different from the sea in the daylight hours. In the day, the Mediterranean is vivid, intensely blue, almost impossibly blue in the full sun. The kind of color that seems more saturated than any color has a right to be. It is a sea of presence, of visibility, of the particular energy that wide open water carries when the sun is on it. But at night, the sea becomes something else. It becomes dark in a way that has depth to it. Not the ordinary darkness of a room with the lights off, but a darkness that has distance in it. Layers of it. The darkness of water that goes down further than any eye can follow. The surface in starlight is quiet, moving in long, slow swells that have traveled enormous distances to arrive at this particular stretch of coast, that carry in their rhythm the accumulated memory of wind and weather from far beyond the horizon. The ship moved out of the harbor. The lights of Joppa receded. And Jonah, somewhere below the deck, in the hold, in the dark interior of a vessel heading west, away from Nineveh, away from the call, away from the presence of the God he was not quite able to stop believing in, even as he ran from what that God had asked of him, went to sleep. This detail, Jonah sleeping in the hold of a ship while fleeing from God, is one of the most quietly human moments in the entire story, because there is a sleep that comes not from peace but from exhaustion. Not the sleep of someone who has resolved their inner conflict and settled into the rest that resolution brings, but the sleep of someone who has simply, for the moment, stopped fighting, who has made a decision, right or wrong, sustainable or not, and in the making of it, has temporarily released enough of the tension to allow the body to do what bodies do when they are finally, blessedly still. Jonah had been carrying the weight of an unanswered call. He had answered it in his own way, not with yes, but with the most definitive no he could arrange. He had turned and gone the other direction, bought the ticket, boarded the ship, and now the ship was moving, and the coast was disappearing, and the stars were out over the Mediterranean, and there was nothing left to decide for the moment. And so he slept, the way exhausted people sleep when they have finally, at least for now, stopped running in their minds, even if the running in their bodies has just begun. the way any of us sleep. Sometimes, in the middle of a flight we are not sure will take us anywhere we actually want to go, simply because we are tired, and the decision has been made, and the ship is moving. And for this one dark hour on the water, there is nothing left to do but let the darkness have us. The stars moved overhead. The ship moved west. The water under the hull was very deep, and very dark, and very patient. And somewhere ahead, not in the direction the ship was sailing, but in the direction of the story itself, the direction of everything that was about to unfold, something was already in motion. Something that had known before Jonah bought his ticket, before he walked down to Joppa, before he turned and went the other way. That running in the opposite direction was not the same thing as actually getting away. The sea knew it. The night knew it. And the great deep, with its long and patient darkness, was waiting. The sea does not hurry. This is one of the things about the ocean that people who have spent time on it come to understand. Not as a philosophical observation, but as a felt, physical reality. The sea operates on a timescale that has nothing to do with human urgency. The swells that move across its surface have been traveling for days, sometimes weeks, born from winds that blew in distant parts of the world and sent their energy rippling outward across thousands of miles of open water. When the sea decides to do something, it does not announce it in advance. It simply begins. The sailors on Jonah's ship were experienced men. They had read the sky before departure, had assessed the conditions, had made the judgment that experienced sailors make every time they leave port, that the sea, on this particular day, in this particular season, was navigable, that the risks were within the range of the acceptable, that the voyage was something they had done before and could do again. They were not wrong about any of that when they set out. What happened next was not the result of poor judgment or insufficient skill. It was something else entirely. The Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea. That is how the text describes it. Not a wind that arose, not a storm that developed, but a wind that was hurled. The word carries the sense of something directed, intentional, aimed. Not weather in the ordinary sense of weather. The impersonal movement of pressure systems and temperature gradients, but something with a purpose behind it. Something that found the sea where Jonah's ship was crossing it and did what it came to do. The storm built fast. The swells that had been long and lazy in the early hours of the voyage began to steepen, to grow shorter and more confused as the wind tore at their surfaces and drove them into one another. The sky changed. The particular way that storm skies change at sea, where the horizon disappears first, swallowed by a wall of cloud and spray. And then, the visible world contracts rapidly around the ship until there is nothing beyond the immediate circle of churning water and driving rain. The ship threatened to break up, This phrase, in the original text, has almost a quality of sympathy to it, as if the ship itself, this wooden vessel doing the best it could against forces far beyond what it was built to withstand, was the one being threatened, the one whose integrity was at risk. The timbers flexed and groaned under stresses they had not been designed for. Water came over the sides in quantities that were no longer simply the ordinary wash of a rough sea, but something more ominous. The beginning of what happens when a vessel starts to lose the argument with the water. The sailors prayed. This detail matters, and it matters in a specific way. These were not Israelite sailors. They were men of various nations and backgrounds. Sailors who had grown up with the deities of different ports and different peoples. Men who, in ordinary circumstances, might have had very different things to say about the God of Israel or the significance of his calls to his prophets. And in the storm, they prayed. Each man cried out to his own God. The text records this almost matter-of-factly, as if noting the natural response of people who, when the situation exceeds the reach of human skill and seamanship, reach for whatever larger power they believe might be listening. And alongside the praying, they worked. They threw the cargo overboard to lighten the ship. A desperate, practical measure. The kind of decision that costs real money and represents real loss. Made by men who had concluded that the cargo was replaceable and their lives were not. Heavy things, carefully stowed for the voyage, going over the side into the churning water. A sacrifice of everything non-essential in the hope that what remained would be enough to keep the ship afloat. The storm did not stop. And somewhere below all of this, below the shouting of sailors and the groaning of timbers and the crash of waves and the desperate prayer to every deity anyone on board had ever believed in, Jonah was asleep. The text is almost startling in how it presents this. The ship is threatening to break apart. Experienced sailors are praying and throwing cargo overboard and fighting with everything they have to keep the vessel alive. And the man whose flight from God's presence had, in some sense that the sailors did not yet know, occasioned all of this. That man was in the hold, below the waterline, asleep. Not lightly asleep. The Hebrew word used here suggests a deep sleep, the kind that does not surface easily, the kind that has to be forcibly interrupted. The captain found him, and the captain said something that, in its context, is almost achingly ironic. What do you mean? You sleeper, arise. Call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us, that we may not perish. Call out to your God. The captain of a ship full of sailors praying to their various gods, in the middle of a storm that was threatening to kill all of them, found the one man on board who was supposed to have a direct line to the God who made the sea, and had to wake him up and ask him to start praying. There is something almost tender in the captain's words, alongside the obvious urgency. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us. Perhaps. He was not certain. He did not know what Jonah's God was like, did not know the story behind the sleeping man in the hold, did not know anything except that this storm felt like something beyond ordinary weather. and that every prayer they had tried so far had not worked, and that this man had a God he had not yet called on. Jonah came up from the hold. The sailors, meanwhile, had concluded among themselves that something about this storm was not natural, that the severity of it, the way it had found them and would not let them go, suggested that someone on board had done something to bring this upon them. They cast lots to find out whose fault this was. Ancient lots, small objects, marked or distinguished in some way, shaken and cast like dice, were used in the ancient world to discern what could not be discerned by ordinary means. It was not a casual process. It was, in its own way, a kind of prayer, a way of asking a question too large for human judgment to answer alone and waiting to see where the answer landed. The lot fell on Jonah and the sailors. Why? Now, with the answer in front of them, turned to him with the questions that the answer demanded. Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation? And where do you come from? What is your country? And of what people are you? The questions tumble out rapidly. The urgency of men in a storm who need information, and need it now, who have narrowed the problem to this one man and need to understand what they are dealing with. And Jonah told them, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. The sailors were afraid. The text says this plainly, and it makes complete sense. They had been afraid of the storm. But this was a different fear. This was the fear that comes when you understand, for the first time, the actual scale of what you are caught up in. Not just a storm sent by the God who made the sea itself, sent for this man on this ship, because this man had done something that required finding. What is this that you have done? They asked him. The text notes that they knew he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them. Jonah, apparently, was being honest now, in a way that he had perhaps not been when he purchased his passage and boarded the ship without mentioning that he was a prophet running from a divine commission. The storm was getting worse. And then Jonah said something that the story has been quietly building toward, something that carries, in the middle of all the chaos and fear and groaning timber, the first quiet note of the larger theme this entire narrative is about. Pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you. This is the moment worth pausing on, because something has shifted in Jonah between the man who paid his fare at Joppa and the man standing on the deck of a storm-tossed ship, asking to be thrown overboard. He is not panicking. He is not bargaining. He is not making promises to God about what he will do differently if the storm stops. He is doing something that, in its own way, is a small but significant turning. The first small turn of a man who has been running in the wrong direction and is beginning, however reluctantly, to stop. He is taking responsibility. I know it is because of me. These words do not solve everything. They do not represent a full repentance or a complete reversal of the flight from Nineveh. But they are honest. In the middle of a storm that was his fault, surrounded by sailors whose lives were in danger because of his choices, Jonah looked at the situation clearly. The way you can sometimes only look at things clearly when the storm has stripped away every comfortable layer of self-justification, and said what was true. This is because of me. The sailors were reluctant. This, too, is worth noticing. These were not cruel men eager to be rid of a problem passenger. The text records that they rowed hard, trying to get the ship back to land, trying to find a way to resolve this without throwing a man into the sea. They were, in their own way, doing everything in their power to avoid the outcome that Jonah himself had suggested. But the sea would not relent. And finally, they prayed, addressed the God they now understood was behind all of this. The God of heaven who had made this sea and sent this wind, and asked not to be held guilty for what they were about to do. And they picked Jonah up and hurled him into the sea. The text says the sea stopped raging. Just like that. The storm that had been building for hours, that had threatened to break a ship apart, that had sent experienced sailors to their knees in desperate prayer to every god they could name, simply stopped. And the men feared the Lord exceedingly. And they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. These men, sailors of various nations, who had come aboard this ship with their own gods and their own understanding of how the world worked, had, by the end of this day, encountered something that rearranged everything they thought they knew. They had met the God who made the sea. Not in a temple, not through a prophet's carefully delivered message. In the middle of a storm, on a ship, because a man who was supposed to be running toward God had been running away. The sea was quiet now. The ship was still. The sailors stood on the deck in the sudden, enormous silence of a storm that has ended. The particular silence that follows violent weather, more profound than ordinary quiet, carrying in it the memory of the noise that just stopped. And somewhere beneath the surface of that suddenly quiet sea, a man was sinking. Down through the dark water, down through the cold, down into the deep. And something was rising to meet him. There is a moment in the experience of falling when you stop trying to catch yourself. It happens after the initial reflex, the automatic, involuntary reach for something solid, something to grab, something that will stop the fall before it goes any further. That reflex is very fast and very human, and almost always futile in the kind of falling that is too large and too fast for hands to catch. And then, when the reflex has spent itself and the falling continues anyway, something else happens. The body stops fighting. Not in defeat. Exactly. More like a kind of radical acceptance that arrives when there is simply nothing left to do when the situation has moved beyond the reach of any action you might take, when the outcome is no longer in any sense within your control, and the only thing left is to be in the falling, fully and without resistance, until it ends, wherever it ends. Jonah was falling into the sea, into the dark, into the cold, deep, ungoverned water that the ancient world understood as the place beyond the edges of the human world, the place where the dry land stopped and something else began. Something older and deeper and indifferent to the concerns of the people who lived on the surface above it. He was sinking now, and the surface, where the ship was, where the sailors were standing in their sudden quiet, where the storm had just stopped as if a hand had been placed over the water, the surface was getting further away. Think about what Jonah could see. In those first seconds after entering the water, the light, first of all, the way light behaves underwater, especially in the open sea at the moment when a storm has just passed. Not the clear light of a calm, shallow sea on a sunny day. Something more turbulent than that. Light scattered and refracted by the churned water, breaking into moving fragments, shifting and fragmenting as the waves above disturbed the surface. Light that gave the water a quality of being almost alive, of moving and breathing in a way that solid land never does. And sound. Underwater sound is nothing like surface sound. The sharp, distinct noises of the above-water world, the crack of waves, the shout of sailors, the groan of timber, become something else entirely once you go below the surface. They become muffled, slowed, transformed into low rumbles and deep resonances that seem to come from everywhere at once and from no particular direction. The underwater world has its own acoustic language, and it is a language of depth and distance rather than the crisp, directional sounds of the air. Jonah sinking through that water would have heard the world transforming around him as he went deeper. The sounds from above getting quieter, the pressure increasing, the slow, even, impartial pressure of water that increases with depth, that pushes gently but insistently on every surface it touches. That makes the body aware of itself in ways the air never does. The light fading. How far down was he before the great fish came? The text does not tell us. It simply says that the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow Jonah, and that Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. The sequence, the falling, the swallowing, the 3 days, is presented without the kind of intermediate detail that would tell us exactly how much time passed between the moment Jonah entered the water and the moment the fish arrived. But the fish was appointed. That word, appointed, prepared, designated, carries a weight that is easy to pass over if you are moving through the text quickly. It suggests that this was not accidental. Not a large fish that happened to be in this part of the sea at this particular moment and swallowed a sinking man more or less by coincidence. Something that had been, in some sense, arranged, prepared, sent to a specific location at a specific time for a specific purpose. The same God who had hurled the wind had appointed the fish. The storm and the rescue were, in this reading, not separate events, one a punishment and one a mercy, but part of a single, continuous movement. The wind that found the ship, the lot that fell on Jonah, the sea that stopped raging when Jonah entered the water, the fish that was already on its way. All of it, one seamless action. Not to destroy Jonah, to hold him. And then the fish was there, in the dark water. At whatever depth Jonah had reached by now, something very large was moving. The displacement of water that a large creature makes as it moves, the way its passage through the water creates pressure waves, currents, a sense of something enormous occupying the same space, would have been felt before it was seen, if it was seen at all in the darkness, and then swallowed. The text uses this word simply, without elaboration, without the kind of descriptive detail that a modern writer might be tempted to add. Just the fact of it, Jonah was swallowed by the fish. The outside world, the sea, the dark water, the distant fragmenting light from the surface, disappeared. And Jonah found himself somewhere that no geography of the ancient world had a name for, because no one had been there and returned to describe it. Inside. Let us stay here for a moment, right here, in this extraordinary and impossible place, because the interior of the great fish is, in its own strange way, the most intimate space in the entire story. More intimate than the ship's hold where Jonah slept. More intimate than the city of Nineveh, where he would eventually walk. More intimate even than whatever private space Jonah had occupied before the word of the Lord came to him and set all of this in motion. It was dark. Not the ordinary darkness of a room with the lights off, where the eyes adjust and shapes gradually emerge from the blackness. This was a more complete darkness. The darkness of a place that had never had light in it. That was not simply the absence of light, but the presence of something older than light. The deep biological dark of a living interior that had no use for visibility. It was warm. This, perhaps surprisingly, is true. The interior of a large living creature is warm, warmed by the creature's own metabolism, by the slow and enormous biological processes that keep something that size alive and moving through the cold, deep water. Jonah, who had just been in the cold sea, would have felt this warmth as a physical reality, not the warmth of comfort. Exactly, but warmth nonetheless. The warmth of being inside something living. It was moving. The fish was still swimming. The text eventually describes it traveling to the shore to deposit Jonah there, which means for the entire 3 days, Jonah was in motion, without being able to control or even clearly perceive the direction of that motion. Moving through the water, inside, something that moved through the water. A kind of stillness within motion, or motion within stillness. The inner world, completely calm relative to the creature's passage through the outer world. And it was quiet. The deep water quiet of a place far below the surface. Below the weather, below the waves, below all of the noise and urgency of the human world above. A quiet so complete that it would have felt, at first, almost like its own kind of pressure. The absence of sound as something physically felt rather than simply noticed. There is something the ancient world understood about the deep, that our modern world, with its submarines and its sonar and its deep-sea cameras, has perhaps made harder to access. The deep was not merely a physical location. It was a symbol, a reality, a name for something that went beyond geography. The deep was where you went when everything else had failed. When the surface of life, all its familiar landmarks, all its known relationships and established patterns and daily routines had been stripped away. When the ordinary world had become inaccessible, whether through circumstance or choice, or the kind of falling that happens when something larger than you decides, it is time for you to stop standing where you were standing. The deep was where you could not pretend anymore, where there was no performance possible, no audience to manage, no version of yourself to maintain for others' benefit, where the gap between who you presented yourself as and who you actually were could not be sustained, because there was no energy left for the sustaining of it and no one there to sustain it for. Jonah was in the deep now, in every sense of the word. And here is what the deep asked of him. In its darkness and its warmth and its complete, enclosing quiet, nothing. It did not ask him to pray. It did not ask him to repent, to make promises, to demonstrate his readiness to do what he had refused to do before. It did not ask him to perform his way back into favor or to earn the right to exist in this extraordinary place. It simply held him, the way that genuine darkness holds you when you stop fighting it. Not crushing, not punishing, but simply present. The way that the lowest points in life sometimes hold you when you have finally, exhaustedly, stopped trying to escape them. When you have spent all your energy on the running and the planning and the self-justification and the careful construction of alternative routes. And all of that has brought you here anyway. And here is where you are. And the question of whether you deserve to be here or not is simply no longer the most relevant question. You are here. The darkness is here. The warmth is here. The quiet is here. And somewhere in the quiet, in the space that opens up when all the noise of the running finally stops, something else is here too. Something that had been here all along. Something that the running had made it impossible to hear. Jonah did not pray yet. That comes later, in the next chapter, in the long, slow middle of the 3 days and 3 nights, when the initial shock of the swallowing has settled, and the reality of where he is has had time to become simply the reality of where he is, unremarkable in its own way, the way any reality eventually becomes unremarkable once you have been inside it long enough. For now, he was simply here, in the dark, in the warmth, in the quiet that the deep makes when the surface is very far away and there is nothing left to do but breathe. In and out, slowly. The way breathing happens when the body finally, after a long time of holding itself tight against the world, allows itself to simply be alive. The fish moved through the water, patient, unhurried, enormous, carrying its impossible cargo through the cold, dark sea with the same steady rhythm it had used to move through these depths long before Jonah arrived, and would use long after he was gone. The surface was very far above. The deep was very dark. And in the belly of the great fish, in a darkness older than memory, a man who had been running for a very long time was finally, completely, utterly still. Time moves differently in the dark. Not faster, not slower, differently. Without the ordinary markers that divide a day into its recognizable segments. The quality of light changing through a window. The sounds of the world shifting from morning to afternoon to evening. The small rituals that punctuate the hours and give them their familiar shape. Time loses its usual texture. It becomes something more continuous, less divided, a single long presence, rather than a sequence of distinct moments. 3 days and 3 nights. That is how long Jonah was in the belly of the fish. 72 hours, by one way of counting. But in the dark interior of a creature moving through the lightless deep, the counting of hours would have been impossible. There was no sunrise to mark the beginning of a new day, no sunset to signal the arrival of evening. There was only the continuous, unchanging dark, and the warmth, and the motion, and the quiet that was so complete it had become its own kind of presence. 3 days. In ordinary life, 3 days is not a long time. It is a long weekend. It is the gap between one Monday and the next. It is the kind of span that, in the middle of a busy life, can pass almost without noticing, consumed by the ordinary demands of work and relationship and the 1,000 small tasks that fill the hours. In the belly of a fish, in the deep, in the dark, 3 days is an eternity. And an eternity was, perhaps, exactly what Jonah needed. The first hours, or what felt like hours, though there was no way to be certain, were probably the hardest. Not because of physical discomfort, though that was certainly real, but because the mind, in the absence of any external stimulus to occupy it, turns inward with an intensity that the busy surface of ordinary life rarely demands. all the things you have been too busy to think about, all the unresolved questions and unacknowledged feelings and carefully avoided truths that the noise of daily life makes it possible to perpetually postpone. They arrive in the dark and the quiet, with a patience and a thoroughness that is almost courteous in its completeness. They had time, nothing but time, and so did Jonah. What do you think about in a place like that? The question is not rhetorical. It is the question at the center of this chapter. The question that Jonah's 3 days in the dark are, in some sense, entirely about. Because what a person thinks about when all distraction has been removed, when there is nowhere to go and nothing to do and no one to perform for, what rises to the surface in that kind of enforced quiet tells you something essential about the actual interior landscape of that person's life. Jonah, in the dark, would have thought about the call. It would have been impossible not to. The call was the origin of everything that had brought him here. The word that came, the commission he could not accept, the flight that had seemed, in Joppa, like a workable solution, and had turned out to be considerably less workable than it appeared. The call would have been present in the dark the way it had been present before the dark. Not as a comfortable thing, not as something he wanted to sit with, but as the unresolved center of everything. And he would have thought about Nineveh, about what it would mean to go there, about all the reasons he had not gone, all the legitimate, understandable, entirely human reasons a person might have for not wanting to carry a message of judgment into the most powerful and feared city in the region. About the fear of it, not just the physical danger, though that was real enough, but the deeper fear, the fear of obedience, the fear of what it means to say yes to something you have been saying no to for so long that the no has started to feel like the truth about who you are. But here is the thing about the dark, and about enforced stillness, and about the kind of time that passes in a place where there is nothing to do but be. It does not only bring the difficult things, it brings everything. And in bringing everything, all of it, the things you have been avoiding alongside the things you have been holding close, the fears alongside the memories, the failures alongside the moments of genuine, unperformed grace. It creates the conditions for something that the busy surface of ordinary life almost never allows. Honest accounting. Not the accounting of self-condemnation, which is its own form of avoidance. The kind where you list your failures so thoroughly and so harshly that the listing itself becomes a substitute for actually looking at them clearly. And not the accounting of self-justification, which is what Jonah had been doing more or less since he turned toward Joppa and started walking. But honest accounting. The kind where you simply look, without the rush to verdict, without the need to arrive quickly at a conclusion about whether you are guilty or innocent, broken or fixable, too far gone or still within reach, and see what is actually there. Jonah, in the dark, began to look. The first day, perhaps, was mostly shock. The shock of the storm, of the lot falling on him, of the extraordinary moment of asking to be thrown overboard and then actually being thrown. The shock of the water and the cold and the dark and the fish. The sheer strangeness of being where he now was, in a place that had no precedent in any experience he had ever had or any story he had ever heard. Shock occupies the mind in its own way, keeps it busy with the immediate and the literal, forestalls the deeper processing that comes later. He was here. This was real. That was enough for the first day. The second day, perhaps, was anger, not necessarily expressed. There was no one to express it to, which in itself was a new and disorienting experience for a man who had, presumably, spent his life in the ordinary human network of relationships and interactions where feelings find their natural outlets. Just anger, present in the dark, cycling through its familiar patterns. Anger at the call. Why Nineveh? Why him? Why this commission rather than a different one? A more manageable one. One that did not require walking into the center of the world's most terrifying empire and announcing its judgment. Anger, perhaps, at himself. The particular frustration of a person who knows, somewhere beneath the anger, that the situation they are in is substantially of their own making. That the storm and the fish and the dark are all, in some sense, the logical consequences of a sequence of choices that began when he turned and walked toward Joppa rather than toward Nineveh. And perhaps this is the kind of thing that the dark eventually brings up, whether you want it to or not. Anger at God. The honest, unperformed, entirely human anger of a person who feels that what has been asked of them is too much, that the call is unreasonable, that a God who truly understood the situation, who truly understood what Nineveh meant, what it would cost to go there, what the likely outcome of such a commission actually was, would not ask this. The anger was real, and the dark held it without flinching. Because this is one of the things that the deep does, that the surface cannot do. On the surface, feelings have to be managed, expressed in acceptable forms, contained within the boundaries of what the social world around you can absorb, shaped and edited and presented in versions that are appropriate for the audience present. Even in prayer, even in the most sincere and private prayer, there is often a subtle pressure toward a certain kind of language, a certain respectful register, a certain management of the raw material of feeling into something that sounds like the way a person is supposed to talk to God. In the deep, in the dark, in the belly of a fish, 3 days from the nearest other human being, none of that management was possible, or necessary, or relevant. There was only what was true. And what was true, for Jonah, was messy and complicated and not particularly flattering, and entirely, completely real. And something about the darkness received it without judgment, held it, let it be what it was, without rushing it toward resolution or demanding that it clean itself up before it was permitted to exist. The third day, or what felt like the third day. 2. The long, slow turn toward whatever was coming next. 2. Was something else. The anger had moved through. Not resolved, not answered, not argued to a satisfying conclusion. Just moved through. The way weather moves through, leaving behind it a different kind of air. The shock had settled into the simple, undramatic fact of where he was. The self-justification had run out of material to work with. Because in the dark, with no audience and no performance and no alternative narrative to construct, the self-justification simply could not maintain the energy required to keep going. What was left, when all of that had moved through, was quieter. Not peace, not yet, but a kind of emptiness that was different from the emptiness of despair, the emptiness of a container that has been cleared, that has room in it now for something that the previous fullness had not allowed space for. Jonah was still, for perhaps the first time since the word of the Lord had come to him, perhaps for the first time in longer than that. In however many months or years, the tension of the unanswered call had been quietly occupying the interior of his life. He was simply still. No running, no planning, no construction of alternative routes or justifications or explanations. Just still, in the dark, in the warmth, in the motion of the fish moving through the deep. And in that stillness, in the space that opened when the running finally, completely stopped, something began to shift. Not dramatically, not with the sudden, overwhelming quality of a revelation that announces itself and demands immediate response. More like the way the quality of light changes in the earliest part of the morning, long before sunrise, when the sky is still completely dark, but something in the darkness has changed. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift that you would not notice if you were not already awake and paying attention. Something in the dark was different. Something in the quiet had a quality to it that the quiet had not had before. Something that felt in the way that the most important things often feel before they can be named or described or understood. Like the beginning of something. Like the first breath after a very long time of not breathing. Like the moment before a word rises from the deepest place inside you. Not a planned word, not a performed word, but the truest word you have. The one that has been waiting through all the noise and the running and the managing for the moment, when everything else has finally, at last, gone quiet enough for it to be heard. Jonah opened his mouth. In the dark, in the deep, in the belly of the great fish, 3 days from the surface, 3 days from the world he had fled, 3 days from the call he had refused and the presence he had run from, he opened his mouth and began to pray. Prayer, in its truest form, is not performance. This is something that is easy to say and surprisingly difficult to actually practice. Because most of us, in most of our praying, are performing for someone. Sometimes for an imagined audience of people who might overhear us and assess the quality of our faith by the quality of our words. Sometimes for God Himself. In a way, bringing to the divine presence the version of ourselves we think is most likely to be heard. The version that sounds sufficiently humble or sufficiently faithful or sufficiently aware of its own unworthiness, rather than simply the version that is actually there, in all its complexity and confusion and need. Performance in prayer is not always dishonest. Often, it is the best we can manage. A sincere attempt to reach for the right words, to frame our actual experience in language that feels adequate to the one we are speaking to. There is nothing wrong with caring about how you pray, but there is a kind of prayer that goes beyond caring about how it sounds. It is the prayer that comes when there is no longer any energy left for performance, when the situation has stripped away every layer of self-presentation, every carefully maintained version of who you are and how you are doing, and what remains is simply the raw material of a human being who needs something they cannot provide for themselves and has, finally, run out of alternatives. That is the prayer that rises from the depths. That is the prayer Jonah prayed. He did not begin with confession. This is the first thing to notice about Jonah's prayer. And it is worth noticing carefully, because it does not match the template that most religious instruction would suggest is the appropriate way to address God from the inside of a fish after 3 days of dark. The expected shape of this prayer, in most religious imaginations, would go something like this. Jonah acknowledges his sin. He confesses that he ran when he should have gone. He expresses appropriate remorse. He makes promises about future obedience. He asks for forgiveness and deliverance. In that order, the repentance preceding the request is evidence of its sincerity. That is not what Jonah prayed. What Jonah prayed was a description. He simply described where he was. Not as a strategic framing designed to evoke divine sympathy. Not as a carefully constructed narrative that presented his situation in the most favorable light. Just where he was. What had happened. What it felt like. What he had experienced in the water and in the dark and in the 3 days of the deep. And in the describing, something happened that no amount of carefully structured confession could have produced. He found himself already heard. I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and He answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. The first thing Jonah says is not what he is asking for. The first thing he says is what has already happened. I called, and you heard. Past tense. Already. Before the prayer is even fully underway, before whatever request or confession or expression of need is yet to come, already, the calling has been heard. Already, in the dark, in the deep, in the belly of what he calls Sheol, the ancient Hebrew word for the place of the dead, the lowest place imaginable, the place that is the absolute opposite of the light and life of the surface world. Already, From there, the cry has been received. This is the extraordinary claim at the center of Jonah's prayer. Not that God will hear. If Jonah can find the right words, or demonstrate the right attitude, or make the right promises. Not that there is a path back to being heard. If Jonah can traverse it successfully, but that the hearing has already happened. That the depth is not beyond the reach of the divine ear. That Sheol itself, the very bottom, the most extreme version of the down that Jonah has been descending into since the moment he turned toward Joppa, is not, in fact, outside the range of the God he was trying to put distance between himself and. You cannot go somewhere God is not. Jonah discovered this not as a theological proposition, but as a lived, embodied, specific fact. Discovered it in the belly of a fish, in the lightless deep, in the third day of a darkness he had done nothing to deserve and nothing to escape. You heard my voice. And then he describes the descent. You cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Notice whose waves they are. Not the sea's waves, not the storm's waves, your waves. Jonah is doing something in this prayer that goes beyond simply reporting what happened. He is interpreting it. He is taking the experience of being thrown into the sea, of sinking through the dark water, of being overwhelmed by something far larger than himself, and he is placing it in a frame of meaning. Not, I was abandoned. Not, the universe did this to me. Your waves. Addressed to the God he had been running from. The God he had been trying to put distance between himself and. The waves that had overwhelmed him were this. God's waves. The deep that had swallowed him was this God's deep. The darkness that had held him for 3 days was, in some sense, this God's darkness. This reframing is not a denial of how hard it was. Jonah does not minimize the experience. He describes it with a vividness that makes clear how real and how overwhelming it was. But he refuses to describe it as abandonment. He describes it, instead, as encounter. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight. Yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. Here is where the prayer opens into something that, in the context of everything that has happened to Jonah, feels almost miraculous. In the darkest moment, the moment when the water was over his head and the seaweed was wrapped around him, and he had gone down to the roots of the mountains, to the land whose bars closed upon him forever. In that moment, something in Jonah said, Yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. Not because the evidence supported this conclusion. By every visible measure, by every physical reality of his situation, the word yet had no basis. He was in the deep. He was in the dark. He had been swallowed. He was, by any reasonable accounting, as far from the holy temple as it was possible to be. And yet he said, yet. This single word is, in many ways, the turning point of the entire book, the hinge on which everything rotates. Not the stone that David threw, not the moment the prodigal son came to himself, not the arrival of the father running down the road, just a small, three-letter word, spoken from the belly of a fish in the lightless deep, by a man who had no evidence to support it and said it anyway. Yet. What is yet? Yet is not optimism, in the casual sense of expecting things to work out, because things usually work out. Optimism has evidence behind it, a track record, a pattern, a reasonable expectation based on past experience that the future will resemble what has been. Jonah's yet had no such evidence. In fact, all the available evidence pointed the other way. He was in a fish. He was in the deep. He had been running from God, and it ended up here. And there was no visible reason to expect that here was a place from which a person returned to look upon holy temples and walk in the light. Yet is something different from optimism. Yet is the refusal to let the worst moment of your life be the last word about your life. It is the stubborn, unreasonable, completely indefensible insistence that the story is not over, that the current chapter is not the final chapter, that what is true right now, however dark, however deep, however complete in its apparent permanence, is not the same as what will be true, yet does not require certainty. It does not require evidence. It does not require the situation to have shown any signs of improvement or the darkness to have lightened by so much as a single degree. It requires only the willingness to say it. In the dark, into the silence, without knowing whether anyone is listening. And then Jonah said something that is, in its context, one of the most surprising lines in the entire prayer. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed I will pay. Thanksgiving. He is in the belly of a fish. He has not yet been delivered. He is still in the deep, still in the dark, still 3 days from the surface and the shore, and whatever comes next. And he is offering thanksgiving, not as a bargaining chip, not I will thank you if you get me out of here, not as a premature celebration of an escape that has not yet happened, but as the natural language of a person who has, in the dark, discovered something that changes the accounting of his situation. He has been heard. He is not alone. The depths have not put him beyond reach. And these facts, not the facts of comfort or safety or the resolution of his circumstances, but these specific, immediate, undeniable facts about the nature of the presence he is in, these are enough to generate thanksgiving. Even here, even now, even in the fish. Salvation belongs to the Lord. This is how the prayer ends. Not with a list of promises about future behavior. Not with a detailed repentance that ticks all the necessary theological boxes. Not with a negotiated agreement about what Jonah will do in exchange for what he is asking to receive. Just, salvation belongs to the Lord. 5 words that contain, in their simplicity, the entire arc of what these 3 days in the dark have produced in Jonah. Not a new set of arguments about why Nineveh. Not a renewed confidence in his own ability to handle what the call requires. Not a plan. Just the recognition, clean and complete and no longer resistible, that the outcome of things is not in his hands. Was never in his hands. The running had been, at some level, an attempt to stay in control of a situation that had never actually been his to control. To manage the call by refusing it. To handle the commission by going the other direction. To take a complex and frightening divine assignment and make it smaller by pretending it wasn't there. And 3 days in the dark, in the warmth, in the motion of the deep, 3 days of having literally nothing to do and nowhere to go and no one to perform for, had brought him, finally, to this. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Not to Jonah's plans. Not to Jonah's obedience or disobedience. His willingness or unwillingness. His yes or his no. To the Lord. And in that recognition, in the full, undefended, no longer argued against acknowledgement of this simple fact. Something that had been held very tight in Jonah for a very long time finally. Completely. Not. Let go. The fish moved through the water. The dark was the same dark it had been for 3 days. The warmth was the same warmth. The quiet was the same quiet. Nothing about the external situation had changed. Jonah was still in the fish. The fish was still in the deep. The surface, with its light and its air and its open sky, was still somewhere far above. But the man inside the fish was not the same man who had gone into the water. Something had been released. Something had been found in the dark that the surface had never quite allowed him to find. A presence, a hearing, a yet that had nothing to do with the circumstances and everything to do with the nature of the one who had made the deep and appointed the fish and heard the cry before the crying was finished. Jonah rested in the dark, in the deep, in the belly of the great fish, with nothing resolved, nothing guaranteed, nothing visibly changed. And somehow, impossibly, inexplicably, in the way that only the deep can produce, at peace. There is a moment in the experience of being held in darkness for a very long time, when the darkness begins to change. Not dramatically, not with the sudden, overwhelming quality of a light switched on in a dark room, flooding everything at once with brightness that makes the eyes ache. More gradually than that, more gently, The way the sky changes in the hour before sunrise. Not the sunrise itself. Not yet. But the preparation for it. The slow and patient lightening of the horizon that begins long before the sun appears. That tells you something is coming without yet showing you what it is. Jonah did not know, in the dark, that the darkness was about to end. He had stopped trying to know things like that. 3 days in the belly of the fish had done what 3 days in the dark does to a person who lets it do its work. It had emptied him of the particular kind of knowing that is really just controlling. The constant internal calculation of outcomes. The management of contingencies. The restless mental activity of a person who is trying to stay one step ahead of whatever is coming. All of that had run down in the dark, like a clock that has simply used up its winding. What remained was simpler. What remained was a man in a fish in the deep who had prayed and had been heard and had said yet in the dark and had arrived somehow at the quiet on the other side of all the noise he had been carrying. And then the fish moved. Not differently. At first, the fish had been moving the whole time. 3 days of slow, enormous, unhurried motion through the deep, carrying its impossible cargo through water so dark and so cold that the surface of the world might as well have been on another planet. The motion had become, over 3 days, simply part of the reality of where Jonah was. The way that any continuous sensation, after long enough exposure, stops being noticed and becomes simply the texture of existence. But something was different about this movement. Direction. Perhaps. The angle of the motion. The sense of up rather than horizontal. Subtle. Almost imperceptible at first. But real. The way the pressure that had been even and constant for 3 days began, slowly, to change. The way the dark, which had been completely uniform, began to carry within it the faintest, most tentative suggestion of something that was not quite the same dark it had been. Light. Not much. Not yet. Just the theoretical possibility of light. The hint of it. The way you can sometimes sense that a room has a window in it, even in complete darkness, simply because the quality of the darkness is slightly different near the window than away from it. The fish was moving upward, toward the surface, toward the light. The text describes what happened next with the same economy it has used throughout. Simple, direct, without the elaborate descriptive apparatus that the moment might seem to demand. And the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry land. Vomited. It is not a gentle word. It is not the word you would choose if you were trying to make the exit from the fish sound graceful or composed or in any way comfortable. It is the word the text chooses anyway. And it is the right word. Because what happened to Jonah was not a dignified emergence from a difficult situation. It was something more abrupt than that. More involuntary. more entirely outside his control. He did not climb out. He did not step out, blinking in the light, having concluded his time in the fish on his own terms and in his own timing. He was expelled. Suddenly, completely, into the open air and the light and the solid ground of the shore. The dry land, the text says, using words that carry in the Hebrew a quality of firmness, of realness, of the opposite of the deep and the dark. Dry land. After 3 days of water and dark and motion and the inside of a creature. Dry land. Think about what that first moment was like. The light. First of all, after 3 days of complete darkness, the most complete darkness most human beings ever experience. The darkness of a place that has never had light in it. The light of the shore, even ordinary daylight, would have been overwhelming. Not just bright in the way that stepping from a dim room into sunlight is bright. Something more total than that. A brightness that came from every direction at once, that made the eyes adjusted to absolute dark for 72 hours. Protest and water and struggle to make sense of what they were receiving. The sounds of the shore, water, wind, birds, the distant sounds of the living world going about its ordinary business, would have arrived all at once, full and dimensional and rich with information, after 3 days of the deep's profound quiet. Not unpleasant sounds, just many, varied, layered. The extraordinary abundance of the auditory world of the surface compared to the stripped-down quiet of the deep. The smell, the air itself, the open, moving, unenclosed air of the shore, carrying salt and wind and all the complex information that air carries when it has been across a large body of water and arrived at a coastline. After 3 days of the air of the interior of a living creature, this air would have been, in every sense of the word, extraordinary. And the ground, the solid, firm, unmoving ground beneath him. After 3 days of motion, the constant, gentle, enormous motion of a large creature moving through deep water. The absolute stillness of solid ground would have been its own kind of shock. The world had stopped moving. The world was improbably stable beneath him. He could press his hands into it, feel its texture, its temperature, its realness, the particular realness of something that does not move, that simply is what it is, that will be there when you press against it, and there when you release the pressure. He was on the shore. He was out. He was breathing the open air. The text does not tell us how long Jonah stayed on the shore before anything else happened. It does not describe him standing up, or sitting up, or what his first actions were when he found himself expelled onto the dry land after 3 days in the deep. It does not give us his emotional response, whether he wept, Whether he laughed, whether he simply lay still for a long time, feeling the ground under him and the air around him and the light on his face. But something in the story suggests that this was not a brief pause. The transit from the dark interior of the fish to the bright open shore of the dry land is, in human terms, the kind of transition that requires time to process. Not just the physical adjustment, the eyes adapting to light, the lungs adjusting to open air, the body recalibrating to a world that has gravity and ground and the smell of things. But the interior adjustment, the recalibration of a self that has, in 3 days of dark, been significantly rearranged. Jonah was not the man who had boarded the ship at Joppa. That man had been running, had been carrying the weight of a refusal, the tension of an unanswered call, the particular exhaustion of a person whose interior is in conflict with itself. That man had gone to sleep in the hold of a ship because sleep was the only way to be temporarily free of the conflict. This man, lying on the shore of a sea he had just spent 3 days inside, was something different, not fixed, necessarily, not fully resolved, not in possession of a clarity that had made every difficult thing suddenly simple, but different in the way that people are different after they have been through something that they did not choose and could not control and could not have survived without help, emptied of something that had been taking up too much space. And because that space was empty, it was available for something else. The word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. The text is precise about this, a second time. The same formulation as the beginning of the book, the same word, the same coming, the same structure of address. As if the first call and the second call are placed in deliberate parallel, side by side, to make a comparison available. The call was the same. Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it the message that I tell you. The same city, the same commission, the same instruction to arise and go. Everything about the content of the call was identical to what Jonah had heard before he turned and walked toward Joppa. And Jonah arose and went to Nineveh. This is the moment the 3 days in the dark had been building toward. And it arrives with a quietness that is almost startling. No extended reflection on what had changed. No explanation of what the 3 days had done to him. No articulation of the internal shift that made this arising different from the arising he had done before. The arising that had taken him in exactly the wrong direction. Just the word came. Jonah arose. Jonah went. But the simplicity of those words should not obscure what they represent. Because a person who arises and goes, the second time they are called, is not the same person who turned and ran the first time. Not because they have become braver or stronger or more naturally obedient, but because they have been somewhere. They have been in the dark. They have been in the deep. They have been in a place where there was nothing to do and nowhere to go, and no performance possible, and no version of the self sustainable except the real one. And in that place, they have discovered something that the surface had not shown them. They have discovered that the deep is not outside the hearing of God. They have discovered that yet is a real word, a word with purchase even in the darkness, a word that the darkness cannot refute, because the darkness does not have the final say. They have been expelled onto the shore, into the light, into the open air. And when the call comes again, the same call, the same voice, the same commission to the same difficult and frightening place, something in them that used to resist has been not broken, but released. The hand that had been gripping the refusal so tightly has been, in the dark, slowly and gently opened. Nineveh was a great city. The text says this with an almost wondering emphasis. Quote, "An exceedingly great city, 3 days' journey in breadth. A city so large that simply traversing it took 3 days. A city of an estimated population that, by ancient standards, was staggering in its size, its complexity, its sheer human density. And Jonah went into it, 1 day's journey in, and called out, yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown." 5 words of proclamation, perhaps the shortest sermon ever preached in a major city. No elaborate theological framework, no carefully constructed argument, just the message, direct, unadorned, exactly as he had been told to deliver it. 5 words, and the people of Nineveh believed. From the greatest to the least of them, the king on his throne, the citizens in their streets, they believed, and they fasted, and they put on sackcloth, tack, the ancient gesture of mourning and repentance, and they cried out to God, the city that had been the terror of the ancient world, the city that Jonah had found it impossible to approach, turned because one man, who had spent 3 days in the dark and prayed from the depths and been expelled onto a shore he never expected to see, had stood in its streets and said the 5 words he had been given to say. The shore is real. This is what the 6th chapter of Jonah's story is ultimately about. Clues, not the specifics of what happened in Nineveh, not the theological implications of a city's repentance, but the fundamental reality that the shore exists, that the fish eventually opens, that the dark does not last forever, that there is, on the other side of 3 days in the belly of the deep, dry land, firm and real and warm under the hands that press into it. The shore is real, and the person who arrives on it is not the same person who went into the water. They have been somewhere. They have been in the dark and the deep and the silence and the warmth, and they have prayed from the depths and been heard and said yet and arrived. Somehow, at a peace that had nothing to do with their circumstances. And when the call comes again, the same call, perhaps, that they have been refusing for longer than they want to admit, they arise, they go, not because it has become easy, but because the dark has shown them something that the surface never could. That they are not alone in it. That they never were. There's a fish for everyone. Not literally. Most of us will not find ourselves swallowed by a creature of the deep. We'll not spend 3 days in the warm, dark interior of something enormous moving through lightless water. The specifics of Jonah's experience are, by any reasonable standard, unique. They belong to a story told across thousands of years, precisely because they are extraordinary. Because they sit at the edge of what any mind can easily picture and ask us to stretch in order to hold them. But the shape of what happened to Jonah, the shape is not unique at all. The shape is one of the most common human experiences there is. So common, in fact, that it often goes unnamed. Often gets described as depression, or burnout, or a dark season, or a difficult period. Described in the language of dysfunction rather than the language of meaning. As something going wrong rather than something going somewhere. The fish is the place you end up when you have been running long enough. When the running has taken you as far as it can take you, and the storm has found you anyway, and the ship is threatening to break apart, and the only honest thing left to say is, I know this is because of me. And then the water closes over your head. Most of us have been there. Many of us are there right now. Your fish might look like a hospital room. It might look like the particular silence of a house after a significant relationship ends. All the ordinary sounds still present. The refrigerator humming, the traffic outside, but the specific silence underneath them that belongs to the absence of someone who used to be there. It might look like a job loss, or a diagnosis, or a season of depression so heavy that getting out of bed feels like climbing a mountain. And the mountain looks different every morning, and is always exactly as steep as it was the day before. It might look like a decision you have been putting off for so long that the putting off has become its own kind of identity. The person who never quite made the call, who never quite followed through, who turned toward Tarshish so many years ago that by now the turning feels less like a choice and more like simply who they are. It might look like a faith that has gone quiet. Not lost. Perhaps. Not the dramatic, definitive loss of belief that some people experience. The clear and complete departure. Just quiet. The God who used to feel near and present and involved in the details of your daily life, somehow further away than he used to be. The prayers that used to feel like real conversations, somehow more like words spoken into uncertain air. The certainty that once felt solid, somehow less solid than it was, without any single moment you can point to when the solidity changed. Whatever your fish looks like, whatever the specific shape of the dark place you are in, or have been in, or are beginning to sense approaching, Jonah's story has something to say to you. The first thing it says is this: the fish is not the end. This seems obvious when stated plainly. Of course, the fish is not the end. The story continues. Jonah comes out. Nineveh repents. The story goes on. We know this because we have read the story, because we have the advantage of seeing the whole arc from outside. But from inside the fish, you do not have that advantage. From inside the fish is simply everything. The dark is everything. The warmth and the motion and the quiet are everything. And the question of whether there is a shore on the other side of all of this is not a question with an obvious answer. It is the question that the dark asks. In the night hours, when the sleep will not come and the mind turns over the same terrain it has been turning over for weeks or months or longer. Is this it? Is this where I am now? Is this what my life is? Jonah did not know. In the fish, that there was a shore coming. He did not have access to the last pages of his own story. He had the dark and the warmth and the quiet and the 3 days. And what he found in those 3 days was not a preview of the shore. It was something available only from inside the fish. Something that the shore itself could never have provided, because it required exactly the conditions that the fish imposed. He found that the deep is not outside the hearing of God. This is the thing that the fish teaches, that almost nothing else can. We know, in ordinary life, that God is present. We are told this. We believe it. We repeat it. I will never leave you nor forsake you. I am with you always, even to the end of the age. We hold these words as true. We assent to them with our minds and our theology and our Sunday morning faith. And then the fish swallows us. And suddenly, the words are not enough. Not because they are not true. They are true as they ever were. But because truth that has only been held in the mind, that has only been believed as a proposition, has not been tested, has not been taken down into the dark to see whether it holds there. The fish is the test, not a test that God administers in order to grade us, not a trial designed to see how much we can endure before we break, but a test in the older sense of the word, the way metal is tested, subjected to conditions that reveal its actual properties, that show what it is made of in a way that no amount of theoretical assessment could show. The fish shows you whether the presence of God is something you know about or something you know. Jonah, before the fish, knew about it. Jonah, in the fish, knew it. There is no shortcut between those two kinds of knowing. There is no curriculum that produces the second without the first. There is only the fish, the specific, particular, difficult, dark fish of your own life, and the 3 days inside it. The second thing Jonah's story says to the person in their own dark place is this: the prayer does not have to be beautiful. Jonah's prayer from the fish is, by many standards, a remarkable piece of poetry. It has structure and rhythm and the characteristic parallelism of Hebrew poetry and echoes of the Psalms woven through it. It is, as we have explored it, a genuinely profound piece of spiritual expression. But it was prayed in a fish, in the dark, by a man who had been running from God and had ended up swallowed by the sea. It was not prayed in a sanctuary, but not prayed on knees in the clean light of a proper place of worship, not prayed in the careful, composed language of someone who had had time to prepare their thoughts and arrange them into something worthy of being said. It was prayed in the only language available, the raw, specific, entirely honest language of a person in distress, describing their distress with no attempt to make it sound more manageable or more theologically tidy than it actually was. And it was heard. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. Not out of the belly of Sheol I composed a sufficiently beautiful prayer that warranted hearing. Not out of the belly of Sheol I demonstrated the appropriate level of remorse and humility to qualify for a divine response. I cried, and you heard. Whatever your prayer from the deep sounds like, however raw, however unformed, however far from the language of the sanctuary, it qualifies. The depth does not disqualify. The darkness does not disqualify. The messiness of the actual human situation, as opposed to the cleaned-up version we sometimes feel we need to present, none of it disqualifies. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. The third thing this story offers, and perhaps the most important thing, the thing that carries the most weight for the person lying in the dark tonight, unable to sleep, turning over the circumstances of their own fish, is the word yet. Jonah said it in conditions that gave him no rational basis for saying it. He said it when the water was over his head and the seaweed was wrapped around him and he had gone down to the roots of the mountains. He said it not because the evidence supported it, but because something in him, something that the 3 days in the dark had uncovered rather than destroyed, refused to let the current moment be the permanent definition of his situation. Yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. Yet, it is the most honest word in the vocabulary of faith, more honest than certainty, which sometimes papers over the real difficulty of the dark with a confidence that has not been tested, more honest than resolution, which sometimes arrives too quickly, skips the actual depth of the darkness in a hurry to get to the light, yet holds both things at once. The full reality of the dark, acknowledged without minimizing, alongside the full reality of a hope that is not based on circumstances, but on something older and deeper than circumstances. Yet is not denial, yet is not premature celebration, yet is the word that keeps you breathing in the fish, in the dark, in the 3 days. Not because you can see the shore, but because something in you, deeper than fear and deeper than the darkness, knows that the shore exists. You do not have to feel it to say it. You do not have to see it to say it. You do not have to have any evidence for it beyond the stubborn, unreasonable, entirely indefensible refusal to let the fish have the last word. Say yet in the dark. Say it quietly. If quietly is all you have, Say it once. If once is enough, say it into the silence, without knowing whether anyone is there to hear it. Someone is there. Someone was there before you said it. Someone has been in the fish with you the whole time, in the warmth and the dark and the motion, present in a way that the noise of the surface had made it impossible to feel, but that the quiet of the deep, finally and completely, makes undeniable. And then, in the time and in the way that only the fish knows, that is not yours to control or predict or schedule, the fish moves toward the surface. It does not ask your permission. It does not consult your timeline or your preference for how this should resolve, or the plans you had made for what your life was supposed to look like before the fish. It moves when it moves, with the enormous, unhurried certainty of something whose direction has been appointed by something larger than either of you. And the shore is there, real and solid and warm under your hands. The light is there. The air is there, moving and open and carrying all the complex information of a world that has been going on the whole time you were in the fish. A world that did not stop while you were in the dark. You are there, changed. Not fixed in the sense of having all the difficult things resolved. The call that sent you running may still be the call, waiting for you on the shore with the same commission it always had. Not healed in the sense of having the wounds of the fish simply erased, as if the dark had never happened, but different. Emptied of something that had been taking up too much space, and in that emptiness, filled with something else. The knowledge, not the theoretical knowledge, not the propositional knowledge, but the lived, embodied, tested and confirmed knowledge that the deep is not outside the hearing of God, that you were heard from the bottom. That yet was a real word, that the shore is real. Tonight, wherever you are, in whatever version of the fish you are currently inside, whatever dark, whatever depth, whatever enforced stillness has stripped away the ordinary noise and the ordinary distractions and left you with just yourself and the quiet. Let the quiet do what it came to do. Let it empty the things that need emptying. Let it still the running that has been going on longer than you remember starting. Let it take the careful, managed, performed version of yourself and set it gently aside, and let what remains be simply what is actually there. The real you, in the real dark, with the real God who made the deep and appointed the fish and heard the cry before it was finished. You do not have to pray beautifully. You do not have to have resolved anything. You do not have to have your yet fully formed before you say it. Just breathe. In the dark, in the warmth, in the motion of something enormous carrying you. Unhurried and certain, in the direction of the shore. The shore is real. You will see it. Not tonight. Perhaps. Not on any timeline that feels reasonable or fair or proportionate to how long you have been in the fish. But yet, always and still and stubbornly. Yet, rest now. The deep is holding you. The same hands that appointed the fish and stilled the storm and heard the cry from the bottom are holding you now. In the dark, in the quiet, in the long and patient warmth of a night that is moving, even now, toward morning. Rest. You are not alone in the deep. You never were.